China, 2,000 years ago, was a land exhausted by ambition. The mighty Qin Dynasty, which once promised eternal order under one emperor, had burned itself out in less than 2 decades. Its roads, its walls, its laws, all built with the blood of commoners, now stood over a nation collapsing under its own weight. The emperor was dead, rebellion was everywhere, and hope was something whispered only in dreams. Amid this chaos lived a man named Liu Bang. He wasn't noble, or powerful, or even especially educated. He was a small-town patrol officer, the kind of man who drank with his soldiers and complained about taxes. Yet something inside him refused to accept that the world had to belong only to the rich and cruel. When the Qin began to crumble, he didn't hide. He joined the uprisings sweeping across the land, a simple man swept into the storm of history. At first, his path seemed ordinary, just another warlord in a sea of warlords. But Liu Bang had a strange sort of luck. He wasn't the strongest, but he was patient. He wasn't the cleverest, but he listened. And more than anything, people liked him. He treated his soldiers like brothers, not tools. In a time when power meant fear, that alone made him different. There was another man, though, Xiang Yu, the hegemon king of Western Chu. He was everything Liu Bang was not. Noble-born, charismatic, terrifying in battle. He could rally 10,000 men with a single cry. If Liu Bang was water, Xiang Yu was fire. One was steady, one was explosive, and their fates were bound to collide. For years, they fought for control of China. Towns switched sides like reeds in the wind, and no one could tell who would win. At first, Xiang Yu seemed unstoppable. His victories were legendary. But arrogance is a slow poison, and Liu Bang knew how to wait. He gathered allies, rebuilt after losses, and slowly tightened the noose. The final showdown came at Gaozu in 202 BCE. The night was cold. Liu Bang's army surrounded Xiang Yu's camp and began to sing, not their own songs, but the folk songs of Xiang Yu's homeland. The sound drifted through the dark like ghosts calling from home. His soldiers, hearing their own people's voices from the enemy lines, broke into despair. Some wept, some fled. Xiang Yu, seeing everything he built dissolve into mist, made his last choice. He rode to the Wu River, lifted his sword, and ended his life beneath the dawn sky. When word of his death reached Liu Bang, he didn't celebrate. He simply stood in silence, as if even he knew what it meant to end an age. Soon after, he proclaimed a new dynasty, the Han, named after the river near his birthplace. It would become one of the longest and most influential empires in Chinese history. For the first time in generations, China exhaled. The wars had stopped. The banners of rebellion were lowered. Fields were tilled again, and children grew up without hearing the sound of marching boots. Yet peace, as it often is, was fragile, stitched together by exhaustion more than trust. The new emperor would have to learn how to rule not just with power, but with restraint. Liu Bang, now known as Emperor Gaozu, was no longer a soldier or a rebel. He was the center of a vast empire that stretched farther than any man could walk in a lifetime. But old habits die hard, and behind the calm surface, the court was already stirring with intrigue. Empress Liu, his clever and ruthless wife, had begun weaving her own web of influence, one that would outlast him. The dawn of the Han Dynasty was beautiful, yes, but it was also deceptive. Empires don't rest easily, even in their infancy. And as the new order took shape, the seeds of both greatness and betrayal were already being sown. When an empire is young, its heartbeat is fragile. The Han Dynasty, freshly born from the chaos of rebellion, had to learn what it meant to rule rather than simply survive. Liu Bang, once a humble rebel leader, now sat upon the dragon throne as Emperor Gaozu of Han. But power, once seized, must be guarded. And no one understood this better than the woman who shared his bed, Empress Liu. Liu Ji was not the kind of woman ancient songs praised. She wasn't known for beauty or poetry or gentle virtue. What she had instead was far more dangerous: patience, intelligence, and a memory that never forgot a slight. While Liu Bang fought battles and built alliances, Liu watched, listened, and learned. She knew how quickly loyalty could vanish when men sought power. So, she built her own quiet kingdom, not on the battlefield, but in the palace corridors, where whispers could kill faster than swords. Life at court in those early years was far from peaceful. Old generals, once Liu Bang's brothers-in-arms, began to grumble. They remembered how they'd fought beside him when he was just a village official with big dreams. Now, they saw themselves replaced by new faces, men who flattered the emperor and whispered against their old comrades. Suspicion seeped through the palace like winter fog. Liu Bang, for all his courage, was still a man who preferred the open plains to the suffocating rituals of court. He distrusted scholars and ministers who spoke in riddles and rules. He often said, "I won the empire on horseback, but you can't rule it from there." The irony was, he never truly learned how to rule it from anywhere else. He relied heavily on instinct and those he trusted most. And trust, in a court like this, was a dangerous luxury. Empress Liu, however, understood the new game perfectly. She saw every look, every alliance forming beneath the surface. When threats arose, she acted, sometimes quietly, sometimes ruthlessly. Those who had mocked her or underestimated her found themselves reassigned, exiled, or conveniently forgotten. She was not cruel for cruelty's sake. She was guarding what her husband had built, and perhaps what she believed was hers to control. Outside the palace walls, the empire was healing. Roads reopened. Farmers returned to their fields. The Great Wall, once a symbol of tyranny, now stood as a promise of safety. Trade began to flow again, and for the first time in decades, people spoke of a future rather than just survival. The Han was taking its first true breath. But peace has a strange effect on men who once thrived on war. The generals grew restless. Some plotted rebellions, others tested the emperor's patience. One of Liu Bang's closest comrades, Han Xin, the brilliant general who had led him to victory, was accused of treason. Whether guilty or not, the outcome was the same. Han Xin was executed. His death sent ripples through the empire, a quiet warning that even heroes could fall. Liu Bang, hardened by betrayal, became more cautious, more distant. His laughter faded, replaced by suspicion. He was an emperor now, and emperors sleep lightly. Even so, no amount of caution could stop what time was already planning. In 195 BCE, after years of illness and weariness, Liu Bang, the man who had risen from common dust to command the empire, passed away. When the court received the news, the air seemed to stop. Servants froze mid-step. Ministers bowed their heads. Outside the palace, the streets filled with the murmurs of a nation in mourning. But behind the heavy curtains of the inner chambers, Empress Liu did not cry. She stood still, her face unreadable. The empire might have lost its founder, but it had not lost its ruler. she would ensure that. In the years that followed, Liu Ji ruled through her son, the new Emperor Hui. He was gentle, kind, and easily influenced, perfect for her plans. Through him, she shaped the empire's decisions, rewarded loyal families, and erased threats to her power. Some said she ruled in his shadow. Others whispered she had become the shadow itself. As her grip tightened, the court turned colder. Those who remembered the days of Liu Bang learned to speak carefully. Those who opposed her vanished. And yet, beneath the fear, there was still order. The government ran smoothly. Taxes were fair. The people prospered. It was as if the hand that ruled from the shadows also kept the light from flickering out. Empress Liu's reign of quiet dominance lasted for years. When her son died young, she placed infants from her own clan on the throne, puppets she could control. Her family, the Liu clan, grew in wealth and arrogance, believing themselves untouchable. But the empire, like the sky, never belongs to one family for long. When Empress Liu finally died in 180 BCE, the court exhaled for the first time in decades. Ministers loyal to the old Han bloodline moved quickly, sweeping away the Liu clan in a storm of vengeance. The dynasty was restored, but the memory of her rule lingered, a reminder that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes the whisper outlives the voice that once commanded nations. The Han had survived its first great test, the death of its founder and the rule of its first great shadow. But beyond the palace walls, new horizons were calling. The Silk Road was stirring, and a young generation was ready to dream beyond the empire's borders. The death of Empress Liu brought silence to the empire, a strange kind of stillness after decades of fear and calculation. With the Liu clan destroyed, the Han returned to its rightful lineage, and the throne passed into the hands of Emperor Wen, a man remembered not for conquest or cunning, but for balance. Where his predecessors ruled through fire and steel, he ruled through gentleness and reason. Under Emperor Wen, and later his son, Emperor Jing, the Han entered a time of peace historians would later call the rule of Wen and Jing. It was an age of calm governance, where punishment softened, taxes lowered, and the people were allowed to rebuild their lives. For once, the empire's greatest achievement wasn't victory in war, but the quiet rhythm of daily life. Farmers plowed without fear, scholars wrote without censorship, and roads stretched farther than they ever had before. But peace has its own dangers. It can dull ambition, and it can make the horizon seem smaller than it truly is. Beyond the borders, the world was vast, and the Han were beginning to feel its pull. To the north, nomadic tribes known as the Xiongnu roamed the endless grasslands, fierce riders who could strike and vanish before the imperial armies even arrived. They were the ghosts of the frontier, unpredictable, elusive, and proud. For years, the Han emperors chose diplomacy over war, marrying princesses to Xiongnu chieftains and sending gifts of silk and grain to maintain peace. It worked for a time. But such peace was fragile, born not of trust, but of exhaustion. Then came a ruler who would change everything. His name was Liu Che, but history would remember him as Emperor Wu of Han, the martial emperor. He was young, brilliant, and utterly restless. When he took the throne in 141 BCE, the world within the walls felt too small. He dreamed not of maintaining peace, but of expanding horizons, of making the Han name echo from deserts to seas. He began by reforming the state. Under his rule, scholars were elevated to new importance, and a philosophy that had lingered on the edges of power, Confucianism, became the empire's heart. The idea was simple but profound, that moral virtue, respect, and order should guide rulers and subjects alike. It gave the empire a sense of unity that laws and armies alone could never create. But Emperor Wu was no philosopher in robes. He was a man of vast ambition. The Xiongnu still threatened the northern frontier, and he decided the time for appeasement was over. Massive campaigns were launched into the steppes. Generals rode for weeks into the endless grasslands, their banners whipping in the freezing wind. The wars were brutal and costly, but they changed everything. The Xiongnu were pushed back, their dominance shattered, and for the first time, the empire's northern border stood secure. Yet Emperor Wu's vision went beyond conquest. He wanted to know what lay beyond the mountains and deserts, the lands where traders whispered of strange goods and golden cities. To find them, he sent an envoy named Zhang Qian on a mission that would become legendary. Zhang Qian journeyed west through perilous terrain, captured and imprisoned by the Xiongnu, only to escape years later and continue his quest. When he finally returned, worn and aged, he brought back stories of kingdoms beyond imagination, of tall horses, unfamiliar music, and lands rich with jade and cloth. From these tales, a dream took shape, a network of trade that would link China to lands as distant as Persia and Rome. Silk, that shimmering fabric so light it could pass through a ring, became the empire's greatest treasure. Merchants began to carry it westward along a chain of routes through deserts and oases, exchanging it for spices, glass, and ideas. The world was opening, and the Han Dynasty stood at its center. Life within the empire changed too. Cities grew, wealth increased, and scholars debated philosophy in candlelit rooms, while poets described the changing sky over Chang'an, the capital. The court shimmered with gold and ceremony. But behind the splendor, new tensions brewed. Heavy taxes funded endless wars and grand projects. The gap between rich and poor widened again. The empire had reached the stars, but some feared it was beginning to drift too far from the earth. Still, for a moment, the Han was radiant. It stretched from the Pacific coast to the edge of Central Asia, a web of roads and rivers humming with trade. Its people saw themselves as part of something eternal, an order that would never fall. At night, travelers resting on the Silk Road would look up at the stars and think of home, of the emperor who had dared to reach beyond the horizon. And far to the west, in lands that had never heard of China before, traders would speak of silk so fine it seemed woven from moonlight. For the first time in history, the East and West were connected by human hands and dreams. And as the wind carried their stories across mountains and deserts, the Han name began to shimmer in the imagination of the world. But every road, no matter how bright, leads into shadow. Emperor Wu's glory came at a price, one the next generation would be forced to pay. For behind the splendor of expansion, the treasury was emptying, and the people were growing restless. The empire had conquered the world beyond its borders, but now it would have to reckon with the storms within. By the time Emperor Wu had ruled for more than 40 years, the Han Dynasty stood at its peak. Its borders stretched farther than any Chinese empire before it. The Silk Road was alive with traders, caravans, and stories that crossed half the world. Scholars praised the emperor's brilliance. Poets compared him to the sun itself, and his image was engraved on countless bronze mirrors. But the higher an empire climbs, the heavier the heavens press down. Glory is expensive, and the martial emperor had built his with coin, blood, and exhaustion. His wars against the Xiongnu and the campaigns to the west had drained the treasury. Fortresses needed rebuilding, armies needed feeding, and new conquests demanded roads that carved through wilderness. The taxes rose higher each year, and the weight fell on those least able to bear it, the farmers. The people of the Han were patient, loyal even, but hunger breeds doubt faster than any rumor. Droughts came, followed by floods. Fields that once yielded gold now gave only dust. Families sold their tools, their land, sometimes even their children, just to survive. Yet the palace at Chang'an still gleamed with gold and ceremony. The emperor believed his empire eternal, but his people were beginning to whisper. Had heaven turned its face away? In ancient China, heaven was not an idea. It was law. The emperor ruled not because of birthright, but because heaven allowed it. If floods or famine struck, it meant heaven's favor was slipping. Every omen, a comet, an earthquake, a dying star, could be read as warning. And in his later years, Emperor Wu began to see signs everywhere. He grew obsessed with omens, terrified that the divine balance he had once commanded was now tilting against him. He turned to mystics and alchemists, men who claimed they could summon immortals or brew elixirs of eternal life. They spoke of hidden islands where the gods walked among clouds, and of potions that could make his spirit rise to heaven as a divine being. Wu, once the conqueror of nations, became a seeker of eternity. He built temples, burned incense, and poured fortunes into rituals that promised to bridge earth and sky. But while he searched for immortality, corruption grew immortal within his court. Officials cheated the people, merchants bribed their way into power, and eunuchs whispered half-truths that twisted into commands. When silver and gold vanished from the treasury, new taxes were created. When rebellions flickered in the provinces, more armies were raised. Each solution was another burden. And then came fear, not from enemies, but from shadows. As age clouded his mind, the emperor began to see conspiracies everywhere. One night, he was told that sorcery had taken root in the palace, that witches and warlocks were casting spells against him. He ordered investigations, and soon the court turned into a theater of terror. Ministers were arrested, families executed, even servants questioned under torture. The fear spread like wildfire. To be accused was to be condemned. Among those who fell victim was his own beloved consort, Lady Guyi, the mother of his youngest son. She was accused of witchcraft by rivals and executed along with her family. The emperor, upon realizing her innocence too late, was crushed. The palace that had once echoed with laughter became silent, heavy with ghosts he could not name. By then, his own body was failing. The elixirs of immortality he had consumed, filled with mercury and strange minerals, had only poisoned him slowly. He withdrew from court, consumed by regret. In his final years, Emperor Wu issued an edict known as the Repentance Decree. It was an extraordinary confession. He admitted his mistakes, the wars, the taxes, the purges, and urged future rulers to govern with restraint. It was the voice of a man who had conquered the world and found no peace in it. In 87 BCE, the emperor, who had ruled for more than half a century, died in his palace. The nation mourned him deeply, for despite his faults, he had made the Han great. His armies had secured the north, His policies had bound the empire together, and his vision had opened the world beyond China's borders. Yet he also left behind a warning that power, without humility, can turn even the brightest rain into a shadow. The throne passed to his 8-year-old son, Emperor Zhao, a child too young to understand the weight of heaven. The empire he inherited was vast, glorious, and fragile. For the moment, it would rest in the hands of those who claimed to serve him: ministers, regents, and generals whose loyalty would soon be tested. And as the empire tried to find its balance again, the winds began to shift. The glory of conquest had faded, replaced by caution, recovery, and the quiet fear that no dynasty, not even one as mighty as the Han, could defy the cycles of rise and fall forever. When Emperor Wu of Han died, his empire exhaled like a soldier lowering his sword after a long campaign. The drums of conquest fell silent, the roads quieted, and the empire turned inward to heal. On the throne sat a child, Emperor Zhao, just 8 years old, too young to understand the burdens placed upon him. Yet sometimes, it is in such innocence that an empire finds peace. Real power during those years rested not with the boy, but with the ministers who guided him. Chief among them was Huo Guang, a man of steady character and quiet wisdom. Huo Guang had been a trusted general under Emperor Wu, but unlike many who rose through war, he sought no personal glory. He ruled the court with discipline, humility, and a sense of duty that became rare in those turbulent times. Huo understood that the Han needed rest more than triumph. He reduced taxes, disbanded excess armies, and encouraged the rebuilding of farmlands devastated by decades of war. His policies brought stability, and the people began to recover. Merchants returned to the roads, villages revived, and the capital once again hummed with the rhythms of life instead of the tension of survival. It was as if the empire, wounded by its own ambition, had found a healer instead of another warrior. The young emperor grew under Huo Guang's protection. Emperor Zhao was gentle and thoughtful, qualities his ministers at first mistook for weakness, but soon learned were signs of strength. He ruled quietly, preferring reason over punishment, patience over pride. He often said that an emperor's true test was not in how much he could take, but how much he could give back. The people loved him for it. Under his short reign, famine subsided, peace returned to the borders, and prosperity crept back into daily life. Yet, as peace took hold, the court began to whisper again. Power, even when wielded with care, breeds envy. Some accused Huo Guang of holding too much influence, of ruling from behind the throne. But Huo never challenged the emperor's authority. When officials flattered him, he dismissed them. When others tested his loyalty, he answered with patience. His restraint became his shield. Fate, however, is never still. In 74 BCE, Emperor Zhao died suddenly at the age of 20. The court was thrown into panic. The empire had lost a beloved ruler, and no clear heir remained. The question of succession, always the most dangerous question in an empire, returned to haunt the Han. Huo Guang once again became the pivot of history. It fell to him to choose the next emperor, and his decision would shape the next generation. At first, he chose Prince He of Changyi, but the prince's arrogance and misconduct became evident within days. In an act of courage that few dared to attempt, Huo Guang deposed the unworthy ruler, a stunning move that risked civil war, and instead installed a distant relative, Liu Bang, known to history as Emperor Xuan. Liu Bang's story was unlike any other. Born into tragedy, he was the grandson of Emperor Wu's executed consort, Lady Guyi, the same woman falsely accused of witchcraft years before. After her death, he had been imprisoned as an infant, forgotten by the court. For him to rise from obscurity to the throne seemed like destiny rewriting its own mistakes. When Emperor Xuan took power, the empire held its breath. Would he rule with bitterness for his family's past, or with gratitude for his restoration? What followed surprised everyone. Xuan proved to be one of the most capable and balanced rulers in Han history. He honored Huo Guang for his loyalty, calling him the pillar of the dynasty, and allowed him to govern as regent with full trust. Under their joint stewardship, the empire flourished once more. The economy revived, frontiers stabilized, and trade through the Silk Road expanded to new heights. The people, long weary of turmoil, found stability under a ruler who combined wisdom with compassion. Emperor Xuan was often seen as the perfect Confucian monarch, stern when needed, merciful when possible, and deeply aware that his duty was not to himself, but to heaven's balance. But no light shines forever without casting a shadow. When Huo Guang died, his family, long accustomed to influence, began to overreach. They grew arrogant, treating imperial authority as their inheritance. Emperor Xuan, though grateful to his late regent, could not tolerate disloyalty. In a quiet but decisive purge, the Huo clan was destroyed. Justice, though harsh, restored balance once again. Afterward, Emperor Xuan ruled alone. His reign continued to heal the wounds of the past, combining the grandeur of Emperor Wu's vision with the wisdom of the Wen and Jing era. It was a golden balance, strength tempered by restraint. Historians would later call this the rejuvenation of the Han, a moment when the empire, aged and scarred, rediscovered its purpose. As years passed and Emperor Xuan grew old, he looked back on a life that had begun in chains and ended on a throne. He had seen the best and worst of power, its cruelty, its temptation, and its potential for good. When he died in 49 BCE, the empire mourned him not just as a ruler, but as a restorer of heaven's harmony. For the Han, this was a second dawn. The cycle of chaos and recovery had turned once again, leaving the empire stronger than before. Yet history, like the seasons, never stops turning. Beyond the horizon, new forces were gathering. Whispers of decadence, corruption, and the slow decay that comes not from invasion, but from within. Empires rarely fall in thunder. They fade like candlelight, one flicker, one shadow at a time. When Emperor Xuan died, the Han Dynasty still appeared strong, still wrapped in the illusion of its own eternity. The fields were rich, the roads busy, and the capital shone under the golden roofs of Chang'an. But beneath the calm, the first cracks had begun to form. The throne passed to Emperor Yuan, Xuan's son, a kind, scholarly man who loved books more than politics. He was raised in the traditions of Confucianism, taught that moral virtue was the heart of good governance. And in theory, he was right. But the palace is not a classroom, and good intentions are often swallowed whole by those who understand power better than principle. Emperor Yuan surrounded himself with scholars and idealists who spoke beautifully of justice, but knew little of the world beyond silk curtains. The ministers who had once guided emperors through crisis were gone, replaced by officials who cared more for debate than for duty. In the court, endless arguments filled the air about philosophy, about omens, about the shape of heaven's will. While beyond the walls, corruption spread quietly through the empire's veins. For the common people, the promises of reform felt hollow. The rich grew richer, their estates stretching farther across the countryside, while the poor found themselves trapped again in debt and labor. Landowners bribed local officials to expand their holdings. Peasants were forced to sell their plots to survive, becoming tenants on land that once belonged to them. It was a slow, suffocating collapse of fairness, the kind that happens not with war, but with paperwork. In the capital, intrigue flourished like mold in a forgotten room. Eunuchs and relatives of the empress vied for influence. Those who flattered the emperor found rewards. Those who spoke too bluntly found demotion or exile. The simplicity of Emperor Xuan's court, once a model of virtue, had dissolved into a labyrinth of favors and secrets. Every friendship hid a transaction, every smile a calculation. The next ruler, Emperor Cheng, inherited not just a throne, but a tangle of deceit. He was young, charming, and easily swayed. His reign would be remembered not for reform or conquest, but for its decadence. The court became a stage for luxury. Music, banquets, and pleasure overshadowed governance. While scholars still preached about righteousness, the empire's heart beat to the rhythm of indulgence. At the center of it all was Empress Zhao Feiyan, once a dancer of extraordinary grace, who captured the emperor's heart and the empire's fate. She and her sister, Zhao Hede, rose from obscurity to wield influence rivaling that of ministers and generals. They were clever, ambitious, and ruthless in securing their power. Those who stood in their way, including other consorts and potential heirs, often vanished under suspicious circumstances. It was said that Feiyan could dance so lightly her sleeves never touched the floor, but her footsteps left deep marks on the empire's soul. Her beauty became legend, her ambition, a warning whispered for generations. While the palace dissolved into intrigue, the outer provinces began to stir. Local governors grew bold, ruling their regions like small kingdoms. Soldiers who once served the empire began serving their commanders instead. The chain that bound the Han together was stretching thin. The emperor, lost in luxury, failed to see it. His childless death marked the beginning of a dangerous pattern, power slipping from the hands of rulers to those who claimed to protect them. Regents, relatives, and factions rose and fell in waves, each one tearing a little more from the fabric of the state. After Emperor Cheng came Emperor Ai, and with him, more turmoil. He was intelligent but impulsive, swayed by personal attachments and flattery. His favorite, Dongxian, became infamous for his rapid rise, from guard to general to near co-ruler. The empire watched in disbelief as favoritism overtook merit, and once again, the whispers began. Had heaven withdrawn its mandate? The mandate of heaven, that invisible thread connecting ruler and cosmos, was the heart of Chinese belief. When rulers acted with virtue, heaven blessed them with peace. When they lost their way, the skies themselves would rebel, with floods, earthquakes, rebellion, or famine. And soon, all these signs began to appear. The Yellow River flooded, washing away villages and harvests. Locusts devoured what little remained. Bandits roamed freely, calling themselves rebels of righteousness. The people began to murmur the words that every dynasty fears most. The Han have lost the way. By the turn of the 1st century BCE, the empire that had once stretched its glory to the edges of the known world was slipping into decay. The court still sparkled with gold and ceremony, but its splendor had become hollow, a mask worn by a sick man to hide the trembling of his hands. And yet, even in decline, the Han still had one last breath of greatness left. It would come not from an emperor or a general, but from a man of ambition who claimed to restore what was lost. His name was Wang Mang, and his story would change the Han forever. Every empire has its dreamers, men who look at a crumbling world and believe they can rebuild it from scratch. After years of corruption and fading faith, the Han Dynasty was ready for such a man. His name was Wang Mang, and to some, he was a savior sent by heaven itself. To others, he was the cleverest usurper in all of Chinese history. Wang Mang was born into privilege. His family, the powerful Wang clan, had risen to prominence through their ties to the imperial court. By the time Emperor Ai and later Emperor Ping came to the throne, the Wangs were already the true power behind the silk screens. But Wang Mang himself was different. He dressed modestly, spoke humbly, and lived with a kind of ritual precision that made others call him virtuous. In an age of greed, his restraint looked like sainthood. When Emperor Ping died without an heir, Wang Mang saw an opening, not for chaos, but for control. He declared himself the regent for the young heir, a child barely old enough to speak. But behind his promises of loyalty and protection, the wheels of ambition were already turning. Slowly, carefully, he began to reshape the empire's narrative, presenting himself not as a usurper, but as a restorer of order, a man chosen by heaven to renew the world. For a time, people believed him. After decades of weak rulers and corrupt courts, the empire seemed ready for reform. Wang Mang promised to return to the purity of the ancient Zhou kings, a golden age remembered in legend and philosophy. He quoted the classics, invoked heaven's will, and proclaimed a series of sweeping reforms that would, in theory, fix everything. Land would be redistributed to the poor, slavery limited, wealth equalized. He even renamed the dynasty itself, declaring the birth of a new era, the Qin Dynasty, meaning new. At first, the people rejoiced. Poets praised his wisdom, scholars wept in admiration, and the empire dared to believe that renewal was possible. But ideals, once placed into law, often clash with reality. Wang Mang's reforms, though noble in intention, collided with the very foundations of society. The powerful landowners resisted, the merchants cheated the new systems, and the bureaucrats, who stood to lose their privileges, sabotaged the changes in silence. In the countryside, confusion turned to chaos. New currencies were introduced, but no one trusted them. Old taxes were replaced with new ones, impossible to understand. Promised land redistributions stalled or backfired, leaving farmers worse off than before. The gap between Wang Mang's vision and the people's suffering widened with every decree. And then, nature itself seemed to rebel. The Yellow River, that eternal mirror of the empire's fate, burst its banks and changed its course, flooding entire provinces. Millions were displaced, their villages swallowed by the mud. Famine followed, then rebellion. Hungry peasants, clutching farm tools and sticks, began to rise up in desperation. They wore red scarves around their heads, a symbol of revolt, and history would remember them as the Red Eyebrows. Wang Mang, surrounded by advisors and omens, refused to see the danger until it was too late. He issued proclamations, built defenses, and prayed to heaven for deliverance. But heaven was silent. The mandate he claimed had never been his to keep. In 23 CE, the Red Eyebrow rebels stormed Chang'an. The capital, once a jewel of marble and bronze, fell to chaos. Palaces burned, courtiers fled, and the cries of the dying echoed through halls that had once hosted poets and kings. Wang Mang, the scholar emperor, the man who dreamed of renewal, was cornered in his palace. Surrounded by flames and rebels, he fought to the end. Some say, with sword in hand. Others say, reciting the names of ancient sages, as if to remind heaven of his intentions. When he fell, the Qin Dynasty fell with him. His body was mutilated, his legacy destroyed, yet his dream lingered in history, a strange mixture of admiration and tragedy. For centuries afterward, scholars would debate whether Wang Mang had been a visionary reformer ahead of his time or merely a power-hungry idealist who mistook philosophy for reality. Perhaps he was both. When the fires of rebellion died down, the empire was in ruins. The Han Dynasty, thought to be finished, stirred once more. Loyalists and surviving nobles rallied under the old name, determined to restore the house that had once ruled the world. Out of the chaos rose a general named Liu Xu, a distant descendant of the Han royal line. He was calm where others were reckless, patient where others sought glory. The people called him the Light of Han. And so, the empire that had fallen was reborn, not as something new, but as something remembered. The Eastern Han Dynasty began, carrying both the memory of its greatness and the scars of its near extinction. The fall of Wang Mang's Qin Dynasty left China shattered, a wounded body searching for its heartbeat again. Cities lay in ruins, rivers had changed their paths, and famine stalked the land like a ghost that refused to leave. But even in the darkest moments, the Han name still carried the echo of greatness. People whispered it like a prayer, and from those whispers rose a man who would bring it back to life. Liu Xu, later known as Emperor Gaozu of Han. Liu Xu was not a conqueror in the mold of Emperor Wu. He was a man of quiet strength, patient and calculating. He had grown up in the chaos of rebellion, seen what ambition without restraint could destroy. When others rushed to seize power, he waited, watching the world tear itself apart, and then moved only when he knew the timing was right. His calmness became his weapon. Starting from humble beginnings in the war-torn province of Nanyang, Liu Xu built his army piece by piece, not through fear, but through trust. He was known for treating his soldiers as equals, sharing their hardships and food, listening to their grievances. Word spread quickly. Here was a leader who cared, who did not see his men as tools, but as companions in a shared destiny. That, more than any battle, won him the empire. By 25 CE, after years of conflict, he declared the restoration of the Han. But the new dynasty would not rise again in the same place. The old capital of Chang'an had been burned and broken. So, Liu Xu built his new court farther east, in Luoyang, a city that symbolized both rebirth and humility. And so, historians would later divide the story in two: the Western Han, and now the Eastern Han. Under Emperor Guangwu's rule, the empire began to heal. He did not seek grand conquest or glory. His mission was restoration. The fields were replanted, the roads repaired, the granaries refilled. Corrupt officials were dismissed, harsh laws repealed. His government emphasized moderation, a word that had become almost forgotten. Taxes were reduced to give the peasants relief. He even pardoned former enemies who swore loyalty to the Han cause. It was as though, after a century of storms, China was finally learning to breathe again. Guangwu's reign was not one of dazzling spectacle, but of quiet rebuilding. His wisdom lay in restraint. and knowing when not to act. He once said, "The empire is weary, let it rest." And so he ruled with patience, ensuring every reform took root before moving to the next. By the time of his death in 57 CE, the empire had regained its strength and stability. The people once again spoke with pride of living under the Han. His successors, beginning with Emperor Ming and Emperor Zhang, carried his legacy forward. Under them, the empire entered what historians would later call the Golden Age of the Eastern Han. The Silk Road reopened, sending caravans westward once more. Trade flourished, connecting China to lands as far as India and Rome. In distant markets, Roman glass met Han silk, and coins stamped with foreign faces crossed the deserts of Central Asia. Silent proof that civilizations had begun to speak without words. But it wasn't only trade that flourished. Ideas traveled too. During Emperor Ming's reign, legend says he dreamed of a golden figure floating in light. Curious, he sent emissaries westward to find the truth of this vision. They returned not with treasure, but with scrolls, the teachings of a new faith from India. Thus, Buddhism first entered China, carried by monks along the same roads that bore silk and spice. At first, it was only a curiosity, but over time, it would grow into one of the most influential spiritual traditions in the nation's history. Within China, culture blossomed again. Scholars compiled new histories and refined philosophies. Artisans perfected their craft, creating bronze mirrors etched with stars and dragons, pottery that seemed to breathe, and scrolls filled with poetry about nature, loss, and renewal. The empire felt alive again, confident but wiser, tempered by memory. Yet even in this golden light, faint shadows began to gather. Court politics returned, as they always do. Eunuchs, once mere servants, started to gain influence by controlling access to the emperors. Their quiet power crept through the palace like mist, unseen, yet inescapable. For now, the emperors were strong enough to keep them in check. But time has a way of eroding even the strongest walls. For the common people, however, these were good years. Fields yielded harvests, trade routes thrived, and scholars spoke of harmony between heaven and earth. The empire stretched proudly once more, its borders secure, its name respected. The Han had survived betrayal, rebellion, and false dawns, and in doing so, had proven something deeper than power. It had proven endurance. Still, as the decades passed, a slow fatigue began to settle. Generations who had never known war grew complacent. Wealth returned to the few, and whispers of corruption began to echo once more. It would take time, but the same cycle that had once destroyed the Western Han was beginning again, quietly, patiently, in the shadows of Luoyang's golden towers. For now, the empire dreamed of eternity. But eternity, as history always reminds us, is just another word for a story waiting to end. The Eastern Han, reborn from ashes, had endured for more than a century. It was strong, cultured, and proud. The capital of Luoyang glistened like a jewel, its palaces shining in the morning light, its markets filled with merchants from every corner of the known world. But beneath that glittering surface, quiet rot had begun to spread again, this time not from foreign invaders or rebel armies, but from within the emperor's own walls. The emperors after Emperor Zhang were young, often too young to rule on their own. Regents and empress dowagers governed in their names, and the palace became a battleground of influence. The men who guarded the emperor's chambers, the eunuchs, began to see opportunities. They had no families, no heirs, and thus no public ambitions, or so it seemed. But power, even when silent, has a way of finding those who crave it most. At first, the eunuchs were merely intermediaries, the gatekeepers between ruler and minister. Yet over time, their role grew. They could grant or deny access to the throne, twist words, forge loyalties, or ruin reputations with a whisper. Slowly, their presence became inescapable. Officials bowed to them, generals feared them, and even emperors, once they realized the depth of their control, were already trapped in their web. Beyond the palace, another force was rising. The scholars, disciples of Confucius, who believed in moral governance and duty to the people. They looked at the corruption spreading through court life and felt disgusted. Their pens became their swords, their memorials to the throne filled with bold accusations against greedy officials and eunuch manipulation. It was bravery of the purest kind, but also the kind that history rarely rewards. This growing divide between the scholars and the eunuchs soon tore the empire's heart in two. The scholars, known as the partisans, saw themselves as defenders of righteousness, while the eunuchs saw them as hypocrites who hid ambition behind virtue. The emperor, often too young or too fearful to mediate, became a prisoner of both sides. The conflict reached a fever pitch during the reign of Emperor Huan and later Emperor Ling. Ministers who dared to criticize the eunuchs were arrested, exiled, or executed. The prisons filled with men whose only crime had been speaking truth to power. The disasters of the partisan prohibitions, as historians would later call it, became a dark stain on the dynasty's soul. Families of scholars were destroyed, their books burned, their names erased from records. Silence fell over the bureaucracy, and where silence reigns, corruption thrives. Inside the palace, luxury grew obscene. Eunuchs sold government positions to the highest bidder. Bribes became a daily ritual. Imperial decrees were twisted to enrich those who issued them. Outside, famine returned, rivers flooded, and the people, forgotten again, began to murmur. The empire, like an old tree, still stood tall, but its roots were hollowing. And yet, even in such decay, there were flashes of brilliance. Science and invention thrived. Kai Lun, a court official, perfected the method of making paper from bark and fiber, transforming communication forever. What once had to be carved into bamboo strips or silk could now be written on sheets light as wind. Ideas could travel farther, faster, and cheaper. It was one of humanity's quiet revolutions, born in a time when words were otherwise being silenced. But even paper couldn't hold back destiny. The empire's body was vast, but its spirit was tired. The frontier generals began to grow restless, commanding armies that were more loyal to them than to the throne. Banditry returned in the countryside, small at first, then swelling into organized rebellions. Local lords fortified their estates. The sound of soldiers drilling began to echo again across distant provinces. The people still looked to the emperor as the son of heaven, but heaven, it seemed, was turning away. Omens multiplied, earthquakes, eclipses, and strange stars appearing in the night sky. Each was seen as a divine warning, but the court, too absorbed in its own feuds, dismissed them or twisted them into superstition. Even the emperors seemed helpless, surrounded by flatterers, their power more ceremonial than real. Then came the final spark. In the eastern provinces, among the peasants who had lost everything to famine and taxes, a movement began to grow, a promise of healing, equality, and divine renewal. Its followers wrapped yellow cloths around their heads and spoke of a coming age of peace. Their leader was a man named Zhang Jue, who called himself the Great Teacher of Heaven. His message spread like wildfire. The old world was ending, and a new one would rise. The empire had ignored its own sickness for too long. Now, the fever was breaking. The stage was set for one of the greatest uprisings in Chinese history, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, and with it, the beginning of the end for the Han. By the middle of the 2nd century CE, the Han Empire was vast, weary, and hollow at its core. For nearly 400 years, it had ruled as the heartbeat of civilization, a dynasty that outlived its founders, its conquerors, and even its own mistakes. But no empire can outlast hunger and despair. And hunger had returned. In the farmlands of the East, famine stalked the people again. Years of mismanagement, taxes, and floods had stripped families of everything. Grain stores were empty, local officials corrupt, and the people's faith in the government crumbled like dry earth. In these desperate times, men turned not to the emperor, but to prophecy. To those who promised that heaven would soon replace the old, broken world with a new one. Among these prophets was Zhang Jue, a wandering healer and mystic who claimed to channel the will of the gods. He spoke of a coming transformation, that the blue skies of Han rule would fade, replaced by a new yellow heaven, pure and just. His followers, peasants and outcasts, wore yellow headscarves as a sign of unity. They called themselves the Yellow Turbans, and their cause was simple: to sweep away corruption and bring balance to the world once more. At first, the movement spread quietly, carried by whispers and traveling healers who preached equality and hope. They treated the sick with herbal medicine and charms, winning the people's trust. Villages that had given up on the empire began to rally behind them. For the first time in generations, the poor believed they had a voice, and that voice was divine. But hope, when starved too long, becomes fire. In 184 CE, the Yellow Turbans rose in open rebellion. From the provinces of Yingchuan and Runan to the plains of Shandong, hundreds of thousands of peasants armed with farm tools, spears, and faith took up arms. They attacked government offices, burned tax records, and tore down the symbols of imperial power. Their banners fluttered under the wind like fields of gold, each one painted with the words, "The Way of Great Peace." The empire was stunned. For the first time since its rebirth, rebellion had spread not from nobles or generals, but from the very people who tilled its soil. The Han court, long paralyzed by intrigue, scrambled to respond. Eunuchs blamed ministers, ministers blamed generals, and the emperor, young, frightened, and surrounded by corruption, could only issue desperate decrees. It was not strategy that saved the dynasty, but the instinct for survival among those who still believed in it. Across the provinces, loyalist forces rallied. Local governors and military officers raised private armies to defend their lands. Among them were men whose names would echo for centuries: Cao Cao, Liu Bang, Sun Jian, and others, figures who would one day carve the empire itself into rival kingdoms. But now, they were simply loyal subjects trying to preserve the collapsing order. The battles that followed were fierce and chaotic. The rebels, vast in number but poorly armed, met disciplined imperial troops hardened by experience. Cities burned, rivers ran red, and the fields turned to wastelands. Zhang Jue, the great teacher of heaven, fell ill and died before he could see victory. Without him, the rebellion began to fragment. One by one, the strongholds of the Yellow Turbans fell. By 185 CE, the uprising had been crushed, but the victory was hollow. Though the Yellow Turbans were defeated, the empire they had risen against was mortally wounded. Entire provinces lay in ruin, millions dead or displaced. Local generals who had raised armies in the emperor's name now refused to disband them. Each controlled their own territory, their own soldiers, and their own ambitions. The central government's authority, once absolute, now existed only in name. And the people, those who had once believed in heaven's favor, were silent. The mandate, it seemed, had drifted away like smoke after a storm. In Luoyang, the emperor sat in a palace surrounded by enemies he could not name. Eunuchs still whispered in the shadows. Generals glared at each other across the court, and the treasury was empty. The dynasty had survived the rebellion, but the rebellion had broken its spine. The empire stood, but only because it had not yet learned how to fall. And from the ashes of this chaos, new powers were already rising. Warlords who would claim the right to restore order in their own image. The Han was dying, but its end would not come quietly. It would burn into legend. The next chapter of its story would not be one of peace or reform, but of ambition, of men who believed they could inherit heaven's mandate themselves. The Yellow Turban Rebellion had ended, but the empire that defeated it was no longer the same. The Han still stood in name, but its foundation had crumbled. What had once been a single empire was now a patchwork of fiefdoms, provinces ruled by generals who no longer bowed to the throne. The emperor, still young and isolated in Luoyang, wore the crown of heaven, but heaven no longer listened. Everywhere, power filled the void. The men who had crushed the Yellow Turbans rose as heroes: Dong Zhuo, Cao Cao, Yuan Shao, Sun Jian, Liu Bei, and many others. Some were driven by loyalty, others by hunger for control. All of them knew one thing: the empire was theirs to claim. The court, meanwhile, had descended into something close to madness. The eunuchs, terrified of losing influence, manipulated the emperor and filled the palace with their allies. Ministers plotted revenge. Soldiers filled the streets. Luoyang, once the shining capital of order, had become a nest of suspicion and fear. In 189 CE, Emperor Ling died, and with him, the last fragile thread holding the court together snapped. Two young princes remained, one destined to become Emperor Shao, the other a pawn. The eunuchs seized control of the succession, but the army's general, He Jin, the Empress Dowager's brother, had other plans. He gathered warlords to the capital, planning to purge the eunuchs once and for all. But plotting breeds counter-plotting. The eunuch struck first, murdering He Jin within the palace gates. His soldiers, enraged, stormed the imperial compound, cutting down everyone in sight. The corridors ran red. Smoke rose above Luoyang's golden roofs. In the chaos, the palace burned, an empire devouring itself from the inside out. Out of this inferno rode a man whose name would become infamous: Dong Zhuo. A brutal and ambitious general from the western frontier, Dong Zhuo marched his troops into Luoyang under the guise of restoring order. But once inside the city, he seized control of the emperor himself. With the Son of Heaven in his grasp, he ruled through fear. Dong Zhuo was a storm in human form. He stripped nobles of their titles, executed rivals, and filled his halls with plunder. He relocated the capital to Chang'an, far to the west, dragging the emperor and the court with him. Those who opposed him were silenced. Those who obeyed were enslaved by terror. His cruelty became legend. The people whispered that the mandate of heaven had truly abandoned the Han. But tyranny never stands alone for long. The warlords of the realm, Yuan Shao in the north, Cao Cao in the central plains, Sun Jian in the south, united briefly to destroy him. Their coalition, though filled with rivalry and mistrust, marched under the banner of justice. For the first time in generations, generals who once served the same emperor now faced each other as equals and as future enemies. Cao Cao, a sharp-minded strategist with a poet's soul, emerged as the most formidable among them. He was neither hero nor villain, but something in between. A man who saw chaos not as tragedy, but as opportunity. He often said, "I would rather betray the world than let the world betray me." His words became prophecy. After years of infighting, Dong Zhuo was betrayed by his own lieutenant, Liu Bang, a warrior famed for his unmatched strength and unmatched arrogance. Dong Zhuo's death brought no peace. The warlords turned their swords against one another, carving the empire into fractured realms. Each claimed loyalty to the Han, but in truth, each sought heaven's favor for himself. Meanwhile, the emperor, now a mere boy, was little more than a puppet. When Cao Cao rescued him from the chaos, it was as much a victory as it was a declaration. Whoever held the emperor held the empire. From his new stronghold in Xuchang, Cao Cao ruled in the emperor's name, issuing decrees that bore the royal seal but his own intent. In the south, Sun Jian fell in battle, but his sons, Sun Qi and Sun Quan, would continue his legacy, building their power near the Yangtze. To the west, Liu Bang, a descendant of the Han royal line, wandered from province to province with only a handful of followers, driven by loyalty to a dynasty that was already dying. And in the center, Cao Cao gathered poets, scholars, and generals, shaping his domain with intellect as much as with iron. The empire was splitting into three great powers: north, south, and west, though none yet knew it. The Han banner still fluttered above the emperor's palace, but it was faded and tattered, a relic of what once was. The dynasty that had lasted 4 centuries was now an echo, surviving only through the names and ambitions of men who used it as a mask. The people, caught between these rising lords, suffered again. Crops burned, villages emptied, soldiers pressed every able body into war. And yet, from their suffering, legends began to form, of loyalty, of betrayal, of brotherhood. Men like Liu Bang, Guan Yu, and Zhang Fei swore oaths beneath peach blossoms, vowing to restore the Han. Others, like Cao Cao, saw destiny in their own reflection. The Han Dynasty was not gone yet, but it was no longer one body. It had become the memory of unity living inside the storm of division. Soon, the land would be divided into 3 kingdoms, and the name of Han would pass into legend, not as an empire, but as the dream of one. The Han Dynasty, once the unshakable heart of civilization, now existed only in name. The emperor sat in a palace surrounded by banners that no longer belonged to him. His decrees were signed by other hands. His throne, though gilded, was a cage. The boy who wore the crown was Emperor Xian, the final ruler of the Han. Born into chaos, he never knew the empire that poets once praised. When he looked out from the palace walls, he did not see a realm united under heaven, only the fires of war burning across endless horizons. After Dong Zhuo's death, the empire had not been saved. The vacuum he left drew every ambitious man into its center. Cao Cao, Yuan Shao, Sun Quan, Liu Bang, names that would echo for centuries, began carving the empire into fragments. The young emperor, helpless amid their rivalries, became a pawn passed from one master to another. Cao Cao was the first to seize him. Taking the emperor under his protection, he moved the capital to Xuchang and ruled in his name. Officially, the Han still stood. In reality, it survived only through Cao Cao's ambition. Yet paradoxically, it was this same ambition that gave China a moment of fragile order. Under Cao Cao's administration, the Central Plains bloomed again. Roads were cleared, fields replanted, scholars invited to court. Even as war raged beyond his borders, he kept the heart of the empire beating. Cao Cao saw himself not as a rebel, but as the restorer of Han virtue through strength. But others saw him differently, a tyrant in a minister's robe, a man who ruled with cunning rather than righteousness. Among those who opposed him was Liu Bang, a descendant of the royal line, who dreamed of reviving the true Han. Where Cao Cao used intellect and iron, Liu Bang relied on loyalty and compassion. His oath brothers, Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, followed him through defeat after defeat, believing in the dream of a nation reborn. Far to the south, Sun Quan inherited his father's coastal power and built a stable domain along the Yangtze. His people prospered in the safety of ships and rivers while the north bled. Each man, Cao Cao, Liu Bang, Sun Quan, claimed to defend the emperor, yet each built a kingdom of his own. In 208 CE, the empire's future was decided not by decree, but by battle. At the Red Cliffs, on the mist-shrouded waters of the Yangtze, Cao Cao's mighty fleet met the allied forces of Sun Quan and Liu Bang. Fire swept across the river that night, ships blazing like fallen stars. Cao Cao's army, vast and invincible on land, was undone by wind and flame. His dream of uniting the empire beneath the Han collapsed in smoke. After Red Cliffs, the land was divided into three. Cao Cao's Wei ruled the north, Sun Quan's Wu held the south, and Liu Bei's Shu claimed the west. The emperor remained in Luoyang, a silent witness to the end of the dynasty. He signed edicts he did not write, granted titles he did not choose, and watched as his realm turned into three separate worlds. Years passed. Cao Cao died, his son Cao Pi succeeding him. In 220 CE, Cao Pi summoned the weary emperor to his court and presented him with a scroll, an abdication edict prepared in elegant script. Surrounded by ministers, Emperor Xian bowed his head and offered the imperial seal to Cao Pi. It was the final act of the Han. No swords were drawn, no battles marked the end, just silence, the quiet sound of history closing one of its greatest chapters. Cao Pi proclaimed a new dynasty, Wei. The Han, after more than 400 years, was gone. And yet, even in death, its spirit endured. The three kingdoms that followed, Wei, Shu, and Wu, all claimed to continue its legacy. Each saw itself as the rightful heir to the mandate of heaven. Each carried pieces of what the Han had built. The philosophies it spread, the systems it forged, the culture it nurtured. These would outlive every throne that came after. In time, the wars would fade, the kingdoms would fall, and China would unite again under new names and new dynasties. But the people would still call themselves the Han people, their land the Han realm, their language the Han tongue. The dynasty had ended, but its name had become eternal. The empire that began with a farmer's dream, that endured tyrants and reformers, rebels and poets, now lived on in every word, every road, every memory. The Han had fallen, but its shadow still stretched across the ages, long after its last emperor laid down his crown. Long after the last emperor stepped down and the banners of the Han were folded away, the memory of the dynasty refused to die. In the centuries that followed, empires would rise and fall. Wei, Jin, Tang, Song, Ming, each shining briefly before yielding to time. Yet all of them look back to the Han as the model of what a civilization could be. The Han had lasted for more than 400 years, longer than the lifespan of most empires in history. It began with a farmer's rebellion against tyranny and ended with poets and generals shaping legends from its ashes. Between those 2 points lay everything that defined ancient China: unity, philosophy, invention, faith, and the eternal dance between order and chaos. It was under the Han that Confucianism became not just an idea, but a way of life. The emperor was no longer simply a ruler. He was a moral symbol, the bridge between heaven and earth. The bureaucracy that Confucian scholars built would last for 2,000 years, shaping China's government, its ethics, and even its family life. Every later dynasty, whether native or foreign, would borrow from this vision of balanced rule, the harmony between law and virtue, duty and compassion. It was also under the Han that China met the world. Through the Silk Road, silk and spice, art and ideas crossed deserts and seas. Roman coins found their way to Chinese markets. Chinese silk wrapped the shoulders of queens and senators an ocean away. The Han turned the empire inward toward unity, but also outward toward connection. It made China not just a nation, but a civilization in conversation with the world. The Han's legacy lived on in quieter ways too. The writing system standardized under its rule still flows through brush and keyboard today. The walls it built became the bones of the Great Wall, known now to the world. The people, in every dynasty that followed, would call themselves Hanren, the Han people. Their language, Hanyu, the Han tongue. Even their script, their art, and their spirit all bore the same name. But perhaps the truest legacy of the Han lies not in its monuments or inventions, but in its story, in the rhythm of rise and fall that mirrors the rhythm of life itself. It began with struggle, reached glory, decayed, fell, and was reborn. It reminds us that even the greatest creations of human hands are impermanent, but that ideas, once kindled, never truly die. When travelers walk the ruins of ancient Chang'an or Luoyang, they still feel its presence. In the worn stones of courtyards, in the patterns carved on broken tiles. The Han is gone, yet it breathes through history like a heartbeat beneath the centuries. Its emperors are dust, its armies forgotten. But its dream of order, culture, and connection lives quietly in the modern world. In every character written, in every tradition kept, in every bridge between past and present, the Han endures. And perhaps that is how all great stories end, not with finality, but with transformation. The dynasty that fell asleep under heaven never truly died. It simply became part of everything that followed, part of the dream we still call civilization.